happened to have breakfast today with my dear friend and former colleague, Jim Beaver. I, mentioned to him that you and I were going to be talking this afternoon. And, I used the term soft power, and he said, I hate that term. I was shocked because, for me, soft power that's what I did. It's a good thing, right? Soft power. But Jim's point was this. When you say soft power, it doesn't have an echo either with the current administration or with the public. It makes it sound as it's somehow mushy. It makes it sound like it's weak. And he asked me this question. He said, Skip, was there ever anything you did as a USAID mission director that wasn't hard? I said, no, actually everything was hard in the sense it was very difficult, but it had an impact. So I don't have an answer. I don't have a synonym or an alternative for soft power. I'm thinking about it. But I think it's important for those of us who believe in soft power and who believe in the work that USAID did and who believe that the provision of foreign assistance is very much in the interest of the United States, both in the past and going forward. I think we need to find different ways to think about it and describe it in a way that more fully captures its impact and its importance.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Unsung Americans, a podcast showcasing the real stories of frontline aid workers and why the work we did overseas mattered to the world and to us as Americans. As always, please like, subscribe, and share, especially with your skeptical friends and family and networks. Today, I am pleased to have Skip Waskin, a decorated leader, project leader, and program leader from USAID who has decades of experience working in some very difficult places, some very interesting places, and some very important places, I think is how I would crudely summarize it, Skip. But why don't let me just have you kind of introduce yourself, where you came from originally, and what made you want to get involved in this work.
Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate you having me on. This is a true honor. I've had the opportunity to watch a couple earlier episodes of this podcast series, and I'm just thrilled to be included. So thank you very much. I am from East Lansing, Michigan. My mother was a professor of education at Michigan State University. My father was deputy superintendent of public. So my family always had in public service. And that's how I met with my orientation. I didn't grow up wanting to be a banker or I wanted to work in the public sector. And probably the seminal event of my young life, so to speak, was when my mother took the whole family, she took my father, my younger brother, myself, to Guatemala in January 1968. And she was teaching at TDY, teaching a temporary duty assignment, teaching at the American School of Colegio Americano in Guatemala City. For all I know, it was funded by USAID, but I was 10 years old, so I wasn't paying attention to the implementation details. And that was really an eye-opener for a kid from East Lansing to go to a place like that. I remember the very first night we were there, we went out to a restaurant and there were children outside the door begging for food. And when we went, my mother being my mother, she insisted that my brother and I go to school while we were there for those 2 or 3 weeks. So we went to the school, but to get to the school, we had to take a bus. And when we walked from our hotel to the bus stop, we were guarded by 2 soldiers carrying submachine guns, which was kind of cool when I was 10 years old, but also made a powerful impression on me. So I really decided at that point that I wanted to do something to help internationally. I wanted to pursue a career in international affairs. And with a lot of twists and turns in between, that's basically exactly what I did. I think my course was set when I was 10 years old, thanks to my mom.
That's cool. It's interesting. Some people have very specific reasons and stories and all that. And, in other cases, I kind of find it's just, well, this looks interesting. I want to learn more about this, or I, for one, I think like yourself, when you grow up around, when your home life involves sort of references on a regular basis to public service, serving our country, serving the United States, serving people. I understand how that has a influence and impact, so to speak. So maybe since you ran huge. I mean, some of the largest USAID missions, some of the largest USAID offices in the world at different points in time. So I'm curious about, specifically from your perspective, what was the point of US? What was the purpose of USAID? Why did we have the United States Agency for International Development?
It's an excellent question, and one that I think all of us who work for USAID needed to be prepared to answer, and still do need to be prepared to answer as we discuss both the past of U.S. foreign assistance and possibly the emerging future shape of that assistance. It was drummed into me. My first job in USAID was as an assistant capital projects development officer in Kinshasa, in a country that was then known as Zaire. Now it's the Democratic Republic of the Congo again. But at that point, which is 1981 now, it was Zaire. And I was hired as a local hire contractor. I'd gone to Georgetown University, got a master's degree, and got my degree, immediately got an airplane, flew to Kinshasa to do a 3-month internship at the American Embassy. And as I said, I thought I wanted to pursue a career in international affairs. I only knew the State Department. I didn't know there were really any other options. I had heard of USAID because one of my professors at Georgetown talked about doing consultancies for it, but I didn't really know what they did. When I got there, I was asked to apply for a job at this thing called USAID. I applied for it. I was interviewed extensively for it. My boss concluded I wasn't qualified, but then he said to me, well, you're clearly not qualified for this job, but what the hell, I'm desperate. So start on Monday. That was the start of my career. A ringing endorsement. But it was made very clear to me by him. This was a man named Henry Lee Braddock, who was the head of the Capital Projects Office in USAID Zaire. It was made very clear to me by him and really by everybody else in the mission, including the mission leadership. The mission director was a guy named Norm Sweet. This was not a charitable organization. Yes, there was a humanitarian aspect to our assistance to Zaire. Yes, we were trying to do good works and help people because it was the right thing to do. But it was also made very clear to me that USAID was an agency of the U.S. government, and we were in Zaire to further the foreign policy interests of the United States. And that was a lesson that was drummed into me from a very early time, again, 1981. I can even remember there was a case, and then I internalized that and made it clear to the people who worked with or for me that this was why we were doing what we were doing. I remember at one point, for instance, we were repairing a dry dock down near the mouth of the Zaire River or the Congo River in a place called Boma, and we had a Belgian engineer working for us, and he was frustrated with Zairean counterparts, and he drove down there and had a screaming argument, yelling at them about why they weren't doing the right things with this dry dock. And when I heard about it, I took him to task, and I explained to him, look, it'd be great for the Zaireans if the dry dock is rehabilitated. It will generate jobs. It will generate employment. It'll be great for the town of Boma. That is not the principal United States interest here. The United States interest is we need to make friends here. We want people to have a positive impact in the United States because Zaire is a strategic country with a lot of mineral assets, and it is, at least nominally, an ally in the Cold War, which we were deeply involved in at the time. So I made that clear. And again, throughout my career, I had several occasions to say to people, your personal behavior or whatever's going on, you need to remember this isn't just a humanitarian. We are not a charity organization. We are an agency of the U.S. government. Having been imbued with that lesson and having practiced it all throughout my professional life, it was shocking to me to hear some of the things that the statements that were made about USAID earlier this year, which seemed to suggest that we somehow had lost sight of that mission. That had no echo in my own experience. We were always very much aware, and I personally, both as an employee of USAID and later as a senior manager within USAID, was very much aware that, yes, we had a developmental purpose, we had a humanitarian purpose, but we were also there to help, and I'll borrow Secretary Rubio's words here, to make the United States safer, stronger, and more prosperous. That's always been our mantra.
It was exactly my experience working on USAID projects most of my career. I mean, honestly, just kind of plain and simple. I think it's easy to get into the sort of intricacies of all of that, but at the end of the day, that that just sort of rung true all the time in my experience. And sometimes for better or for worse, but at the end of the day, that was the focus. That was the mission, Um, one thing, I think one thing you said, I did want to draw attention to, especially for any skeptic out there, is if you want to keep playing around on your iPhone and your iPad, you want the US to continue to have a significant influence and presence and engagement meaningfully in the Democratic Republic of Congo at the time when you were there, Zaire, where the critical minerals mattered then. I think they probably matter even more now because that's one of the primary sites for, what do you call it? Sound like a real genius here now, but
rare earth, critical minerals.
yeah, rare earth minerals that,
right.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the world's largest cobalt and one of the largest producers of copper. And you're right, we're not having this conversation through my iPad that we're having right now without probably minerals that came from Zaire or a country like that.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's also interesting. I don't want to say that it's always fairly easy to say, no, it's pretty easy to say in this country. That's why we were operating in South Africa. That's why we were operating in Kenya. That's why we were all over West Africa. For those of us doing it, it's fairly easy to explain why it was in our interest to be operating in all the places we were operating in. That doesn't mean there isn't always room to, on a rolling basis, revisit exactly what you're focused on strategically in a given region or country. But that's actually a good segue into something you and I briefly talked about not too long ago in our first conversation about having you on the podcast. But you ran the mission in Afghanistan during some of the most challenging years, I think, and we can come back to that. But interestingly, you also ran the mission in Mongolia, a country I think a lot of Americans and people maybe don't hear about or talk about that often. One of the reasons I think that's interesting is that was actually quite a small investment, especially by comparison to other USAID missions. But it was also, I think, a good example of how you can have a small mission like that, and maybe there's not a lot of attention on it, but you can achieve big results. And Mongolia is critically important, actually. And I'm going to let you speak to that more because you were the one on the ground for a long time there. But maybe just briefly introduce what was your role there and function, and then we can kind of get into what were some of the on the ground activities and what did they produce.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So I was the what they call the aid representative. It wasn't a full scale mission, so they didn't have a mission director. I was the aid representative, but everybody called me the mission director. So basically, I was the guy in charge. Very small office. It was only a $10 million annual program, and of course that was somewhat commensurate with the size of the country because Mongolia, while geographically vast, at that time only had I think 2.7 million people, approximately half of which lived in the capital city of Ulaanbaatar, and the rest were scattered throughout the countryside. But yes, Mongolia is significant for a number of reasons. It is, for one thing, Mongolia has been extremely helpful to the United States as we were carrying out various foreign policy initiatives, particularly in the global war on terror. Mongolia contributed troops both in Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, I had the opportunity to speak to Mongolian troops in Afghanistan and when I got there, and that was a very memorable and heartwarming experience. So there is a sense there where they've been a reliable ally. They're also a democracy, not a perfect democracy by any means, but they're a functioning democracy. There have been several peaceful changes of government between different parties in the years since they threw off, if you will, the Soviet yoke, or the years that they would put it, the years of socialism ended in the early 1990s. So in that part of the world, that's a huge success story, and it's something that the United States certainly wants to reinforce. And then the third factor I would add, again, a parallel situation to what we discussed with respect to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. What do the Mongolians have that we need? They have critical minerals and rare earths, and it's very nice to have a relationship with a country like that, and help secure that source of supply. So again, what we were doing in Mongolia was extremely helpful to the Mongolians, I think, and I can talk if you like in more detail about the program. But getting back to first principles, or the first question you have to ask, why was it in the interest of the United States to be there? Because they have been our reliable allies, because they're a fledgling democracy, and because they have products that we're interested in continuing to have access to.
Yeah. Um, yeah, no, again, I think it's, it's interesting. It's actually a place that, as an aside, one of those places I'd love to go there someday. Sometimes I think those places that are that seem and feel and sound particularly remote are interesting. I mean, I got to go to Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, gosh, a year and a half ago. That's a fascinating place to go and work. But anyhow, maybe could you give an example of a specific project or activity and what we were doing and why we were doing that in particular while you were there?
Sure. I mean, look, we basically had five projects. So it was very easy for me to keep track, right? And I knew all the chiefs of party, and we were all social friends, a small expatriate community there. We were working on economic policy reform, a project called Economic Policy Reform and Competitiveness, which had wonderful access to the prime minister and to his government. And the interesting thing for me about that project was when I got there, I asked them, the head of the project, a guy named Dr. Fernando Bertoli, what's your policy agenda? And he said, we don't have one. I said, what do you mean? Every time I've been in aid for many years by this point, every time there's some kind of economic reform program, we have a policy agenda that we're furthering. And he said, no, here we ask the Mongolians, what's their policy agenda? And then we help them further that. So for me, that was a bit of a revelation. And it was, I think, one of the reasons that project was so successful. We also worked on the judicial sector. You often have problems in USAID, as I'm sure you know, when you have a particular intervention that's working well on the local scale. Say you've perfected a means of marketing dates in northern Sindh province in Pakistan. How do you scale that up nationally so it has some impact? It's very difficult in a place like Pakistan. Mongolia, that's not the problem. Our judicial reform project, we trained every judge and we rehabilitated every courtroom. There are something like 89 courtrooms and 450 judges, got them all. And most of the judges were women, by the way. So no problem scaling. We also had a program working with the International Republican Institute that was training the members of the legislature and the political parties in basically in how to conduct themselves during an election. And it was open to both parties and both sides. There were more than two parties, of course, but it was open to all parties, let me say. Again, very, very successful, very much up in demand. And then two really wonderful projects. One was called the GARE Initiative, which was working. A GARE is the Mongolian word for home, or what we would call a yurt. What happened is that after the fall of socialism, literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Mongolians who were not free to move around the country, not free to live where they wanted to during the socialist period or the communist period, suddenly they could migrate. And guess what they did? They migrated to the cities. Well, this was a tremendous strain on the urban services, tremendous strain in terms of transportation, air pollution, water, sanitation, you name it. It's a problem. Electricity. So this program was to help the people living in those GARE areas. It wasn't focused on infrastructure per se, because others were doing that. What we did was we focused on helping them create commercially viable businesses and on working with the banking system to help make those businesses attractive candidates to receive loans by creating things like alternative forms of collateral, for example. So that was great. But then, of course, you had a huge population that was still living in rural areas, and they are very, very subject. Basically, they're herders. Mongolians tend to be herders, and they have goats and they have sheep and they have yaks and they even have camels. So the GARE initiative, or not, pardon me, the what we call the Gobi initiative was to work with those herder populations and effectively teach them better practices for animal husbandry, but also teach them one aspect of that was how and when to find water. And a third aspect of it was to give them information about the what the market prices were for their livestock and their other related products, like wool, for example, from their sheep. Mongolia has, they would argue, the best cashmere wool in the world. Um, and it was important that they have access to information so that they could get fair prices for it. So this was a small program, as I said, only about $10 million a year, but it did a lot of good things in terms of reinforcing Mongolia's democratic transition and opening up new pathways for economic growth for disadvantaged populations, both in the peri-urban areas and in the rural areas.
Yeah, it's cool. And one of my favorite, and I've probably beat this horse to death thus far through the episodes of the podcast, so I'll try not to spend too much time on this, but you talked about helping to support the commercially viable businesses, right? And I think that phrase is just worth drawing some attention to for a moment, because in my experience, that's what a lot of the work was. It was figuring out you're in a country that's a lot less developed than the United States. You want the country to be more prosperous so that it can be more stable, so that it can be more peaceful, so that the institutions can become stronger and long lasting and sustain themselves. Because at the end of the day, you want to have a good partner, particularly in Mongolia, where there's a strategic interest, not just because of critical rare earth minerals, but also because of their position with respect to China. And it's probably a different discussion, but there's that piece too. But the commercial viability, you don't just go around and give handouts to organizations or businesses. It just never really worked like that in my experience, or for the most part, it didn't, especially when it was functioning well. It was about find and help commercially viable businesses,
Right, exactly.
and then there's another thing that kind of stood out to me, and this came up in another conversation a few weeks ago about in the Philippines, and I think again elsewhere, but that example sticks out to me because it was the same principle of the Mongolians were actually driving their own policy agenda. If we go in somewhere, as much as if we want to accomplish something, you have to, there's a bit of a give and take, isn't there? And I would imagine you had to do a lot of this at that higher level where you're interacting with the highest levels of government in a country. But I, I always found that we could accomplish more when we were working with the host country and treating them respectfully as the host. What are your priorities? This is what we want that would help us. And that, you look for win-win scenarios. It's not these relations between countries. I mean, they're like relations with your neighbors wherever you live, or your coworkers, or your community and social circles. They're not zero sum, right? It's not a zero sum game. And that's one of the things I find these days is alarming, is when people talk about things in terms of a zero sum game. I'm like, where does that work well? But, and I don't know if was that kind of your experience? Am I going off the rails, or is that?
No, it's absolutely right. I think my experience, not just in Mongolia, but throughout my career in the world of foreign assistance, if you will, it's not an issue of I win, you lose, or you lose, therefore I win. It's a question of cooperating and helping each other. I was struck as I listened to the recent podcast you did with Lauren Stoddard, and I thought he put it very well. And I'd encourage your audience, if they haven't listened to that episode, listen to it. Well worth your time. But he pointed out that countries that try to pursue, I think the term is autarky, in other words, complete self-sufficiency, that always impoverishes them and impoverishes everybody else. Everybody benefits from trade. It's a win-win relationship. And I think everybody benefits from the kind of, cooperative programs that we tried to implement in places like Mongolia. It was in the best interests of both countries.
I'm sure that was quite an experience to run the Afghanistan mission there for a time when you were the mission director. Again, when you and I were talking recently, you just kind of touched on the USAID partnership with the United States military, and maybe you could speak to that a bit. What did that look like? And obviously, maybe the caveat I should give here is, and many of the countries are working in, there's maybe there's a small United States military presence, or there's some officers at the embassy or something. But in many cases, there isn't there's no active conflict. There's no real conflict to begin with. So there isn't necessarily an opportunity to partner. But in Afghanistan, it's very different. Could you speak a bit to what that, or actually maybe my first question should be, did USAID and the United States military cooperate well and cooperate regularly and effectively in Afghanistan, or was that maybe more of a problem and challenge?
No, we did. The answer is yes, we did collaborate. We collaborated extensively. I think we collaborated well and effectively. And I should be clear, not just with the United States military, but also the NATO military, particularly but not exclusively the British, who were active in Helmand province, which was an area of particular interest to us. Let me tell you a story sort of about that. First of all, you're right. I went from Mongolia, which was one of the, if not the smallest USAID mission in the world, to being the director of what became, while I was there, in dollar terms, the largest USAID mission in the world. So that was definitely a bit of a managerial challenge for me. To give you a sense of the scope of it, I remember I mentioned earlier when I said about Mongolia, I used to joke that, well, I can always find all my chiefs of party if I need to meet with them. They're usually all within at lunchtime. They're near a French restaurant, so I'd go there and I could assemble them all. Very simple thing to do. I meet with all five of them simultaneously. I got to Afghanistan. I said, I want to meet with all the chiefs of party. And my OMS, wonderful woman named Grace Aganya, sort of looked at me askance and said, all of them? I said, yes. She said, well, we don't have a room in the embassy that's big enough to accommodate all, because there were more than 100. So I realized I wasn't going to be able to have the same kind of personal relationship with everybody. So it was a very big challenge, much larger management challenge, and a budget of well over $1 billion a year, as opposed to the 10 million I've been overseeing in Mongolia. That was a big shift, obviously, and forced me to change my optic. But one of the things that was very clear to me when I became mission director is that I had sort of several constituencies that I had to pay attention to. One of them, of course, was Aid Washington, and through Aid Washington, the State Department, which was keenly interested in what we were doing in Afghanistan. Another constituency was the U.S. ambassador, the embassy more broadly, but particularly the ambassador, who was, for most of my tenure, an absolutely superb Foreign Service officer named Ron Newman, who I was very privileged to work for and learned a great deal from. And the third constituency, because of the nature of the situation in Afghanistan, where we were engaged in an ongoing, what they call kinetic situation, meaning there was a shooting war going on around us, was with the NATO military, and particularly the United States military. One of the first people that I met, I think I'd been in Afghanistan for a week at most, and when he asked to see me and I went to his office, was the commanding general of the U.S. forces, a man named Carl Eichenberry, Lieutenant General then Carl Eichenberry, who, by the way, after he retired from the military, then he himself became the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. So he spent a great deal of time in Afghanistan. He had been friends with or knew the woman who was my ambassador, Pam Sloots, when I was in Mongolia, and Ambassador Sloots was kind enough to reach out to Lieutenant General Eichenberry and say, you really need to meet Skip Waskin, and he did. So I went to his office, which was kind of a big deal. And what he said to me was, look, you and USAID, you guys need to, he showed me a map, right? And he pointed to Zabul province. And he said, this is the key. This is the key to defeating the Taliban, to the counterinsurgency effort, I guess you'd call it, that we were engaged in. Again, that term wasn't always in favor, but that's what I used to describe it. I think that's what he used at the time. This is the key to the counterinsurgency effort. You need to build these roads in Zabul province, and you need to do it now. And then he said to me something that I'll never forget. He said, if you don't build these roads, American soldiers are going to die. Now, that is quite a thing to say for a senior commander like that, to say to a civilian who's never served in the military, myself. And I took it to heart. And I said, what could I say? I could have said, well, we're gonna see, maybe we'll take 6 months to draft a concept paper, and then we'll submit it to Washington, and maybe 2 years from now we'll get some funding, and possibly in 3 years we can start to work. That was not the right answer. The right answer was, yes, sir. We're going to start building the road right now. And that's what I did. That's what I told him. And I then went back to the mission and met with my program officer, another outstanding officer named Thomas Johnson, and explained to him what I just said to General Eikenberry. And I think all the color drained out of Thomas's face. And he said, "My God, you committed. We don't have any money for that. You've committed an anti-deficiency violation." I said, "Tut tut, my boy. I'm the mission director. I'm supposed to think big thoughts like this. Yeah. Finding them. You're the program officer. Finding the money is your problem. So find it." I've thought the big thoughts, and it says find the money. So he did, Thomas being the resourceful fellow that he is, and we moved quickly. We gave the money we couldn't afford to go through a competitive procurement. There's no time for that. Again, keeping in mind what Lieutenant General Eikenberry had told me, American soldiers are going to die if you don't move quickly. And that was always one of my mantras when I worked in Afghanistan was we need to move, as I put it, with alacrity. So in this case, we did move with alacrity, and we found two organizations that we didn't that we didn't need to have a competitive procurement if we wished to engage them. One was the United Nations Office of Project Services, UNOPS, a public international organization, therefore exempt from the requirement for competition. The other was the United States Army Corps of Engineers, another agency of the U.S. government, exempt from the requirement for competition. So we gave them both half the money. They started at other end, each one end and opposite ends of the roads, and worked toward the middle. So that was an example of what a small example, but an important example of the kind of collaboration that we did. But more broadly, I was frequently asked throughout my time in Afghanistan, again, early in my time in Afghanistan, well, what's your strategy? The military would ask me, both the American and the British military, what's your strategy for, say, Bagram, Kapisa province or Zabul province? Well, I don't have a strategy for Kapisa or Zabul or any other province. I have a national strategy. That's how USAID works. And some of the activities in that national strategy will take place in Kapisa and some will take place in Zabul. And, I don't know. They said, you have to know. They needed to know because they operated on a very time-bound and geographic specific basis. And they needed to know what was happening, where and when, and who their allies were and what we were doing and again, what everybody was doing basically. They needed what they call situational awareness. So I had brought with me the guy who was my de facto deputy in Mongolia, Jeff Goodson, and I asked him to come to Afghanistan with me as my chief of staff. I brought Jeff out to fill it. And Jeff was, I assigned him to, basically his brief is the chief of staff. I said, I'm dealing with the ambassador. I'm dealing with Washington. Karl Abdurrahman, our extraordinarily talented deputy mission director, is managing the mission. You got to deal with the military. And the number one thing he did was to create a playbook, basically of everything, everywhere that we were doing. If we were building a school, if we were building a medical facility, if we had an agricultural alternative livelihoods project, who was there, where they were, so that the military could look at any place in the country and know where the USAID activities were. And this, I thought, was absolutely essential to both our own safety and the safety of our implementing partners. And it was essential to the broader effort in which we were engaged, which was a counterinsurgency effort, which of course it had political and social aspects, but also very truly had a military aspect. And we needed to be part of that. And we were.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I was saying a minute ago, well, normally there simply isn't a need for the cooperation between USAID programs, USAID and the military, because in many of the countries, it's not what did you call it, a kinetic situation. We're not at war. And it's just, it's interesting to hear, but also how quickly you and, how quickly you were able to respond to the needs of the United States military, Another I'm going to shift gears here, and thank you for all that. Shifting gears over to Pakistan, where you went to work there the latter part of your career. And also recently, one of the many untrue and unfair, there was some criticism against USAID that frankly was fabricated. The evidence used was fabricated. There was criticism that mistook things that did happen as being done by USAID when in fact they were not. And then there was just criticism that where they might have used numbers and built this many schools in a place we shouldn't have built schools, which just demonstrated a deep lack of understanding of why we were doing something. Oh, we shouldn't be doing that. We don't want kids in Pakistan in school, right?
Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy to speak to that. Yes, I was in Pakistan from 2012 to 2018, somewhat of an unusually long period of time. I had actually retired from USAID, but you know, just when you think you're out, they pull you back in. All right, USAID asked me to come back and do a mission management assessment in Islamabad, which I did. And then while I was there, they said, "How would you like to take over and become the head of the USAID office in Karachi?" with the title of deputy mission director. And I said, well, my goodness, a man like me, I mean, I've been the head of I'm the largest USAID mission in the world as mission director. Why would I want to be deputy mission director? But I said, I got to go down there anyway and check it out. And so I went down there to check it out. And I found a very interesting dynamic. A program was being run by the Karachi office, which involved not just, it aspired not just to construct schools, but they were also running they had a program. They were building a new hospital in a place called Jacobabad. They were building a water system in a town called Jacobabad. And they had, through the Office of Transition Initiatives, were doing a number of very interesting things, or trying to get a number of interesting things launched in the city of Karachi itself. Interesting things in terms of bringing youths from one part of very much an ethnically, and I dare I say it, tribally riven city, or to start talking to each other in ways that they otherwise wouldn't have. So it was a real interesting portfolio, and I thought, this plays to my skill set. I'd like to take it on. But the question then is, and that you're raising, is why were we doing this? Now, the criticism that's been made of all these programs, and I'm going to paraphrase it here because I don't think I could repeat it verbatim, but basically what I heard members of Congress repeating talking points that have been given to them. And the talking points were along the lines of, the United States funded the construction of schools for terrorists in Pakistan. Now, the reason that criticism stung and angered me, frankly, is it was precisely the reverse. Why were these programs in place? Well, as it happened, prior to my arrival in Pakistan, the U.S. ambassador, Cameron Munter, had commissioned a study of the root causes of violent extremism to try to look at what's causing violent extremism, geographically, where was it coming from in Pakistan? Because, as you know, there was a great deal of trouble, if you will, along the border with Afghanistan in what was then known as the FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, and then the broader province surrounding FATA, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But that particular FATA and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or KP FATA as we called it, didn't have a large population. And what we discovered was that many young youths, young men, were going from other parts of Pakistan to KP FATA, to the border with Afghanistan, and joining the Tehrik-e Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban, basically, and causing a great deal of trouble. To the point where in 2008, 2009, a few years before I got there, I think Pakistan was really teetering on the brink of becoming a failed state, actually having the government fall. These people, where'd they come from? Well, they came from a lot of places in Pakistan, but one of the principal areas they came from were the suburbs of Karachi and northern Sindh. So this is where our program was focused. And what were the drivers of extremism? Well, it's very complicated. And I learned long ago being an undergraduate, be wary of single factor explanations. There's no single factor explanation. Again, there are historical factors, there are cultural factors, there are theological factors, there are economic factors, and there are sort of political factors. And one of the things that's a driver, not by no means the only driver, but a driver of extremism is when people come to believe that the government that they're supposed to be serving their needs cannot in fact meet those most basic needs. What are the basic needs that a government needs to meet? Well, it needs to provide education, it needs to provide health, it needs to provide water. And I think corollary to that, in one of your episodes, you discussed it needs to pick up the damn garbage, right? So what were our programs doing? What were we trying to do? Well, you mentioned we launched a program with the government of Sindh, not the government of Pakistan, but the government of Sindh, because in Pakistan. Pakistan's a federal system and education is a provincial responsibility. So we launched a program with the government of Sindh to build 106 schools throughout northern Sindh and the suburbs of Karachi, precisely the areas most at risk of violent extremism. We also were putting in a world-class, effectively, hospital, 130-bed hospital to provide tertiary medical care in a place called Jacobabad. And we were rehabilitating the water system that serves the now some 300,000 residents of the city of Jacobabad. Why was that important? It's important because, again, those areas were a hotbed of, were very much at risk of violent extremism. People from northern Sindh, from Jacobabad, elsewhere, were migrating to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. People had lost faith in the ability of their government to provide them services. And we were attempting to restore that faith, so to speak, in a certain, again, our resources weren't unlimited. We couldn't do everything, but we did what we could. And I think we made a significant impact. Over a 10-year period, we built we, meaning government of Sindh, built with our financial and administrative support. They built the 106 schools, each of which serves about 500 children. So you do the math in terms of the number of students every year that are benefiting from that. We put in a functioning water system in Jacobabad. We tried to put in a functioning garbage system in Jacobabad, which I'm actually going to be in Pakistan next week, and I'll be asking these questions about what's going on with that project. So I've heard some stories about it. Some aspects of it are quite successful, others not. And we built the hospital, and we built a big maternity ward I failed to mention earlier in Karachi itself. And we worked through OTI, through what's called the Karachi Youth Initiative, which is a program we never labeled as a USAID program, but was very, very successful in building bridges of understanding, if you will, through sports and cultural activities among diverse communities in Karachi. All of that was specifically designed not to assist terrorists, but really to get at the root causes of terrorism. It was exactly the reverse of the criticism that's been made. So I'm very, very proud of that program. And it was not perfect by any means, but I think most aspects of it proved to be very successful.
Yeah. And I mean, again, it could be overcomplicated, but people do extreme things out of desperation. Take away what's causing their desperate situation.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
They didn't choose their desperate situation.
Yeah, right. And if they're not getting anything, I'd be prone to violent extremism myself. If living here in Fairfax, Virginia, if there were no schools, if there were no hospitals, if there was no water, if my garbage wasn't being picked up, I'd be pretty annoyed, to say the least. And I probably would become desperate and would take it, as would you, I imagine, as would anyone. And I certainly wouldn't feel any terrible devotion to the government that was failing me. And so again, these programs that USAID was funding in that area were precisely designed to get at the root causes of terrorism, and then to ask the broader issue: well, what do we care about the root causes of terrorism in a place like Pakistan? Why is this in the interest of the United States? I mean, you don't have to look very far back in history to understand that. We walked away from Pakistan for different reasons in the 1990s, and we paid the consequences of that in New York City and Washington on September 11th, 2001. So it's very, very much in the United States' interest to prevent a nuclear-armed country like Pakistan from becoming a breeding ground for terrorism and extremism. And I don't think of an understanding to figure out why that's not.
Yeah, and it's something I think a lot of people do not realize or simply don't know, that Pakistan's got nuclear weapons.
They've got nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Right.
And of all the countries with nuclear weapons, they're either the or one of the closest to alarming instability, let's just say, right?
Exactly.
There's something I thought of there that I think a fair criticism or question or concern from just, a kind of an American that's not as, that doesn't follow a lot of the international issues and, just wants to understand, or you know, is concerned that we're spending money on something like that instead of spending money here where, maybe an argument can be made there's people in desperate situations. And I think I want to acknowledge that, because I think that's maybe in our circle, knowing what we know, we may not see it as a fair question, or we may not want to look at that. But I'm just bringing it up here because people have said this to me multiple times. I think it's been in comments as well. I don't think it's a question of stop doing that over there because we need to reallocate the resources here. And because it's not well, first of all, back to the zero sum issue, different kind of context here, but it's kind of a yes and to me. We need to address the issues we have here at home, but if we don't address the issues that you're talking about, we can have another situation where airplanes fly into buildings and kill Americans on American soil, right? So I think what I would say to all of that, and I'm interested in your take on this too, obviously, but I think one of the reasons people say that is because they think we were spending massive amounts of money, all of this, because there are people who've been elected to office who've actually said that, right? The reality is the cost of USAID was less than 1% of the national budget. And for many of these programs, it's the equivalent. Years of one specific USAID program was the equivalent of sending some weapons over in one fell swoop to one of our allies. And I'll leave it cryptic at that, right?
Exactly. Look, the cost of the USAID assistance, what we call soft power, as compared to the cost of hard power, is de minimis, very, very small, relatively speaking. General Eikenberry would put it this way. He said, where the roads end, the Taliban begins, which is another way of saying that where development assistance ends, then the military operations have to begin. And you want to change that equation. You don't want to have to. You don't want to put American soldiers and our blood and our treasure at risk. It's much more expensive in terms of lives and in terms of money to fight extremism once it's manifested itself than it is to deal through these other kinds of programs with the root causes of that kind of extremism. I'm reminded what I think former Defense Secretary Mattis said about, if you cut USAID's budget, I'm going to have to buy a lot more ammunition. So again, it's not an either or situation. Should we not be assisting poor people in need in the city of St. Louis, for example, where you're located, or even right here where I'm located in the suburbs of Washington, D.C.? Of course we should, but it's not an either or situation. We're a country with significant resources. We can afford to do both, and we should do both. And again, if you don't look at the dynamics of the world around you, around us, and attempt to address those situations, as you put it, Alex, they will come back and bite us in the long run. And it's very important. We have a responsibility to protect our country. We have a responsibility to care for our citizens internally, but we have a responsibility at the same time to protect our country externally. And that responsibility has, yes, a significant military aspect, but I would argue also a significant diplomatic and development aspect.
And I fully agree with you. I would say on that note, I very much appreciated having you here. Is there anything else you wanted to raise or just say before we conclude?
There's one point that I do want to mention. I happen to have breakfast today with my dear friend and former colleague, Jim Beaver, who, like me, is a former USAID Afghanistan mission director. He was also director in Egypt and occupied various other very senior positions in the U.S. government, a long and distinguished career. One thing he said to me really surprised me. I mentioned to him that you and I were going to be talking this afternoon, and I used the term soft power, and he said, "I hate that term." I was shocked because for me, soft power that's what I did. It's a good thing, right? Soft power. But Jim's point was this: when you say soft power, it doesn't have an echo either with the current administration or with the public. It makes it sound as it's somehow mushy, makes it sound like it's weak. And he asked me this question. He said, Skip, was there ever anything you did as a USAID mission director that wasn't hard? I said, no, actually everything was hard in the sense it was very difficult, but it had an impact. So I don't have an answer. I don't have a synonym or an alternative for soft power. I'm thinking about it, but I think it's important for those of us who believe in soft power and who believe in the work that USAID did and who believe that the provision of foreign assistance is very much in the interest of the United States, both in the past and going forward. I think we need to find different ways to think about it and describe it in a way that more fully captures its impact and its importance. So I'll leave it at that, but I wanted to make that point, give Jim due credit for raising it, because I thought it was an important, interesting point.
I appreciate it very much, and I will confess it's not my favorite term. But this is what several just months of reflection and intense conversations with all of our peers and friends and colleagues who, for many of us, risked our lives doing this work to serve other people and serve the interests of the United States. But I say this, serve the interests of the United States, because I think we all always thought that and have always believed that and still do, and wish the work would come back so we could go back to doing it. But the more I talk to people, despite how cynical many of us can be from just having a lot of these very challenging experiences, even prior to the past year, where all of USAID's work's been dismantled, but I'm struck by the most consistent theme is American values. What are American values? What do we really value? And where does that best manifest itself? Where do we really see American values in action? Where do we see American values having this impact? And I'm starting to see that more and more from talking with people. And I'm not saying I have a whole speech from a pulpit to give on that right now, but I am starting to actually believe more than I did before while I was doing the work, that we had far more impact and did far more good in the world that made us safer, stronger, and more prosperous. And that getting away from that is going to make us weaker, less prosperous, and in greater danger.
I couldn't agree more. Very well.
So I hope it comes back. That's all I'll say, because otherwise we're ending on a pretty dreary note there. But Skip, thanks very much for joining me today. And
it's really been my pleasure. Thank you. This was, like I say, a great honor to participate. Thanks for inviting.
And thanks for your service. And signing out from Unsung Americans, once again, thanks very much to everyone out there who listened all the way through. Please like, subscribe, and share, and we will see you next time.